Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's episode, we are joined by the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Open Notebook, Dr. Siri Carpenter. The Open Notebook is a science journalism nonprofit organization that provides tools and resources to help science, environmental, and health journalists at all experience levels sharpen their skills. Siri co-founded this group with science journalist Jeannie Erdman. She finished a stint as president of the National Association of Science Writers in 2020. She has been an editor at Discover Magazine and Science News for Students and has written for Science and Scientific American, among many other places. She joins us from Madison, Wisconsin. Thank you for talking to us today. Can you take us through your path as a science journalist, dating all the way back to when you discovered that you had a passion for science and how that's kind of played through in your career?
Hi, sure. Thanks, Mark. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I would be happy to do that. My career path as a science journalist, I guess, dates back to when I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin. I was a psychology major back in the early 90s, and I had this realization that I thought that I would like to be a writer and that I'd like to write about science. And I didn't really have a better formed idea than that. And I asked around a bit of professors in the psychology department, and I went over to the English department and asked sort of, I'd like to write about science. Is that a thing? And pretty much people said, no, I don't think so. And for some reason, it never occurred to me that what I was picturing was in fact, journalism. So unfortunately, I never went to the journalism school and asked these questions. If I would have, I would have found out that there is a field of science journalism, but I didn't. And I did feel passionate about the research that I was doing in psychology and social psychology, studying prejudice and stereotyping. And so I went to grad school for psychology at Yale University. And then I was a couple of years into my program there when I had this realization that science writing was in fact a thing. I think that happened because I had gotten into the habit of reading the New York Times science section on Tuesdays. My department subscribed to the New York Times, and it would be sitting around in the faculty and grad student lounge. And so I was in the habit of reading it. And one day I just kind of had this brainwave that these people who were writing these articles about science on Tuesdays, that this was their job. And if that was a job, then that could be my job. And gosh, I really wanted that job. And that's really all that I knew. And this was before Google was a thing. And so I went home and I entered science writing into a search engine called Alta Vista, which I don't know if it even exists anymore. And when I did, I found out that science writing was a thing, that there's a National Association of Science Writers. And so that told me, yes, these people exist. This is a career and it could be my career. And the way that I really got started was thanks to that website, because I didn't know anyone who was a science writer or who knew science writers and who knew how to get started in that career. But the National Association of Science Writers website had a page, if you can believe it, called Science Writers with Email. And so I emailed all those people, and I think it was like 20 people or so who were listed as science writers who have email. This was about 1997 or so. And one of those people wrote me back. His name is Charles Seif, and Charles is now a professor of journalism at New York University, but back then he was a young science journalist, and he was very kind to answer my questions and to begin to educate me about what science writing is and how you could get started as a science writer. And he told me about the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, Mass Media Fellowship Program, which is an internship program for science graduate students and postdocs who are interested in science writing to intern at a media outlet for the summer. And I was lucky enough to get one of those internships and spent a summer working at the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Richmond, Virginia. and had the time of my life, and I was really hooked.
So that's how I got started.
And what led you to start the Open Notebook?
Well, that was a lot later. That was back in 2010. So we just celebrated our 10th anniversary. In 2010, I was, a number of years into a career as a freelance science journalist. And I had become friends with Jeannie Erdman, who is a science journalist who's based outside of St. Louis. And Jeannie and I would have periodic conversations, kind of accountability conversations, the way that writers sometimes do, to talk about what we're working on and help motivate each other and read each other's pitch letters and mull over story ideas and so on. And oftentimes we would find ourselves talking about a specific story that we had read and that we liked, and just talking about, wondering how that writer did such and such thing. How did they find that idea? Or how did they get access to a certain source? Or how did they figure out how to structure that story, or how to start it, or how to end it, or whatever? And we, along the way, had the idea that it would be great to just interview a few people about these stories that we admired and to get the story behind the story. And our idea was that in doing that, we would learn about the working processes of the writers who we admired, and how they executed such great stories, and that therefore we would get better at it ourselves. And then pretty quickly we thought, well, hey, if this would be valuable for us, maybe other people might like to read those interviews, and so maybe we should make a website. And so it started off as very much a labor of love, and really kind of a self-interested one. We wanted to get better at our craft, and we thought that just diving into the story behind certain stories would help us get better. And then pretty quickly we realized that this was, in fact, a really compelling process for us, and that people who were reading those interviews were also finding them to be useful and compelling, and we're also hungering for greater understanding of how other science journalists and the best science journalists did their work.
I would describe the Open Notebook as useful and compelling overall. Let's look at it at a practical level, though. Let's say that I'm writing a story about an astronomical discovery, or a new cancer drug, or a technological advancement, or something in the social sciences like psychology of decision making. I come to the Open Notebook. What happens?
Well, it would depend a lot on what your questions are. We, at the Open Notebook, we have published around 450 articles on the craft of science writing, and they cover a wide gamut of subjects, from how to find and shape story ideas, how to pitch story ideas to editors, how to work with editors, how to handle rejections from editors. There's a lot about dealing with editors, how to read a scientific paper, how to make sense of the statistics in a scientific paper, how to interview experts, how to interview people who are not scientific experts, but whose lived experience is relevant to your story, how to cover stories that haven't been peer reviewed, preprints. It's a big topic during the pandemic, especially. How to find diverse sources and make your reporting and writing inclusive, how to do data reporting, just on and on. So if you were to come to the Open Notebook, you might have specific questions that you would put into the search bar. I need to write a lead. How can I figure out how to write a better lead? Or I am worried that this paper that I'm reading has some kind of fishy seeming statistics. How can I understand whether that's the case? I am going to be interviewing a source who has experienced trauma, and I don't want to mess that up. So you could do searches for those kinds of topics. You could browse through different collections that we have. Like we have a collection, for example, of stories really aimed at people who are getting started in science journalism. We have a collection of stories about narrative storytelling practices in science journalism. We have a collection on environmental journalism. We have a set of resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion in science writing. And then we have, I think by now, a couple hundred interviews with writers that are these deep dive story behind the story interviews about how people have executed other stories. So those can serve as inspiration, and we try to make sure that every story that we do is really just chock full of practical tips, and try to aim our stories at multiple levels of experience. So we have a lot for beginners, but we also have a lot for people who are tackling various difficult aspects of science writing that can be a challenge for people at any level of experience. One of the things I might mention that we also have is last year we began to translate some of our stories into Spanish. And so we have a growing collection of Spanish translations of some of our stories. And so if you are a science writer whose first language is Spanish, then we hope to be building this collection of resources in Spanish.
All this time that you've spent studying science journalism, I think this qualifies you to answer some questions about science journalists and what traits do they need the most in order to be good science journalists.
That's a great question, and I really like the way that you focused it on traits, which is a bit different than skills. There are any number of skills that you need as a science journalist that are all learnable, and those skills involve some understanding of statistics or how to get answers about statistics, some understanding of the scientific method, etc. Of course, various writing skills and reporting skills. But the traits that a science journalist most needs, I think, are really interesting to talk about. I'd say number one, curiosity. If you are not curious about the world and about the role that science plays in the world, then you're probably not well suited to being a science writer. And then, of course, in addition, an interest in telling stories about science, because there are plenty of people who may have plenty of curiosity about science, but just don't fancy themselves storytellers. To be a journalist of any kind, of course, you need to have a commitment to facts and to the idea that there is such a thing as a fact, and that there's a reality to be reported. And then I think that there's a sort of emotional trait that you have to have as a science journalist, and that is a tolerance for feeling ignorant sometimes, because you're always coming to new topics that you know not much about, and that you know less about than the people you're interviewing. That's why you're interviewing them. And so being able to tolerate that feeling of ignorance and being willing to ask, quote, dumb questions, I think is really important. And especially for people who come into science writing from science, people who've gotten a PhD in science, that feeling dumb is uncomfortable. And there's a real temptation to not want to show that you feel kind of dumb about some aspect of what they're studying. You don't have the expertise that they have. And that can be a problem when you're reporting, because not wanting to ask the basic questions leads to not getting the answers to those questions so that you can share them with your audience. And so that's why I say that it's so important to be willing to ask the really basic stuff, even if it makes you feel dumb.
Where else do you find that writers need coaching when it comes to science writing?
I think one of the really frequent common challenges that I see people having over and over again is just the challenge of shaping ideas, especially for feature stories, and moving from a topic to a story. And as an editor at various publications, I very often have seen people pitching topics instead of stories. And what I mean by that is, a topic, I like to use the analogy that a topic is a noun and a story is a verb. And editors are constantly asking freelancers, pitch me stories, not topics. Ironically, editors are very often assigning topics to freelancers and asking them to find the story. But that whole process of finding the right angle to tell a story and shaping an idea into a story is a persistent challenge for many science writers. pitching stories to editors effectively is a big challenge. What I always say is that if you aren't able to sell a story to an editor, then you aren't going to be able to tell it to an audience. And one of the reasons that the Open Notebook publishes this pitch database that we do, which is a collection of, right now it's around 215 successful pitch letters, like magazine and newspaper and online pitch letters to editors, is because we realized years ago that we weren't seeing a lot of examples of other people's pitches. And so freelancers are very often operating in the dark, trying to figure out what an editor needs to hear from them in order to assign them a story. And so we thought a collection of examples of successful pitch letters would be valuable, and it's proved to be super, super popular.
In terms of writing itself, on the podcast, I regularly invoke stories about my mentor, Dr. Robert Cole. Can you explain the importance of the advice that you got from your mentor, which was write for Dr. Fauci's aunt?
The story that you're referring to is a piece of advice that I got from my first mentor in science writing, A.J. Hostetler, who was the science reporter at the Richmond Times-Dispatch when I interned there back in the late 90s. And A.J. used to advise me, and I think she advised generations of interns after me, to write stories like you're writing for Tony Fauci's aunt. And that advice basically amounts to telling stories in a way that is simple and that your audience is going to be able to understand. And she got this advice or came to this idea after hearing Dr. Fauci give a talk in the late 80s during the AIDS crisis, and he was talking with a group of science writers in Washington, D.C., and he talked about how he had been very proud of himself and the way that he was communicating about AIDS when he was giving public speeches and so on. But then he was visiting with his aunt, and his aunt told him, Tony, it's really wonderful to see you on the news. We're so proud of you, but I really can't understand anything that you're talking about. And his realization was that he felt that he was not doing a good enough job in communicating about science in a way that lay people could understand. And so he tries to remember to communicate about science as though he's talking to his aunt. And so AJ took the advice away that she also would try to communicate as though she were writing for Tony Fauci's aunt, which I think is a great story and very cute and timely now. I also do want to add, though, that very often when science writers talk about trying to communicate clearly, they invoke the idea of this hypothetical audience, and we'll say, talk about it like you're telling it to Tony Fauci's aunt, or like you're telling it to your mother or your grandmother or some other individual. And very often the person who is invoked in that hypothetical is a woman. And I do think that is something to be careful of, because it can propagate this idea that it's women who are ignorant about science or women who are unable to understand complicated ideas. And of course, that's not the intention. In the case of the Tony Fauci story, it was literally his aunt. But I do think it's something to be wary of in thinking about how we talk about how we communicate, because it's very easy to continue to perpetuate stereotypes that are damaging in doing that.
In the site's mission statement, this kind of segues into this topic. It says, "At no other time in human history has the meaning of what constitutes a fact, a valid piece of knowledge, been more at risk than it is today. Journalists' ability to communicate facts about science clearly, accurately, and engagingly has never been more critical for public understanding of science and for a well-functioning democracy." So with that, what has it been like to promote science writing in the age of Trump compared to what it was like to promote it in the age of Clinton, Bush, or Obama?
Right. Yeah, this has been an extremely challenging time for science and for journalism. There's there's a blurb on the front of the book that we published this year, The Craft of Science Writing, by the great journalist Jackie Banashinsky, who says, in an era when facts are under assault, this book is especially welcome. And I really think that this idea that facts have been under assault is so... it's just so obviously clear now that the last 4 years have been, I don't think that assault is hyperbole to use that term. And of course, we're seeing that just in the last, couple of weeks surrounding the election, that the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy thinking and the labeling of facts as fake news over the last few years has had a really damaging effect on our society and is a real challenge for journalists. It means that science journalists are always fighting a rearguard battle about what we might think would be unassailable facts. And that makes it difficult to communicate ideas when you're fighting just to establish the very viability of the concept of a fact. How is it different in the Trump years than it has been in previous years? Trump did not invent misinformation, and the idea of distrust in journalism did not begin with Trump. He has worsened it, and his surrogates and allies have worsened it. And I do think that it's come to a crisis level, but it's not something that is brand new as a challenge for journalism. It's also, I think it really just highlights the critical importance of journalism in this time. During the course of the pandemic, personally, I have relied so heavily on the information and insight that journalists have brought that have guided, just my own personal decision making during the pandemic, as recently as this week, in thinking about Thanksgiving and how to handle the possibility of my daughter coming home from college at Thanksgiving and what is an appropriate quarantine and can we hug her, and just really basic questions like that where we're utterly lacking in reliable, trustworthy, clear guidance from our elected officials, and where we are getting it is from journalists.
We'll be back with more with Siri Carpenter in just a moment.
Welcome to Journalism History, a podcast that rips out the pages of your history books to re-examine the stories you thought you knew and the ones you were never told.
I'm Terry Finneman, and I research media coverage of women in politics.
And I'm Nick Hirschon, and I research the history of New York sports.
And I'm Ken Ward, and I research the journalism history of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Find the Journalism History Podcast at journalism-history.org/podcast and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.
I saw this on the site as well, and it kind of goes along with what you just said. And the skills that science journalists need are endangered. Only a fraction of working science journalists are trained in formal journalism programs, and with the shrinking number of traditional staff jobs available, science journalism is fast moving toward a gig economy that relies on freelancers. How do we fix each of these issues here?
Yeah, those are big challenges, and they have been challenges that have been facing our field for a long time. I think that those words were on our website a decade ago when we started it. It is the case that science journalism is not a well-paying field, for one thing, nor is most of journalism. And a lot of science journalists come into the field without having had formal training, like through journalism master's programs. And there's a barrier to entry for aspiring science writers because of the financial struggles that the entire journalism industry is facing. And that barrier is especially problematic for aspiring journalists from historically marginalized communities. And so those are big challenges. I think, how do we fix that as a community? One thing that I think is just really important, and that is the kind of foundational idea behind the Open Notebook, is mutual support for professional and skills development. And that's what we try to propagate and help sustain and support through the Open Notebook. And that is also a major goal of many other organizations, journalism organizations, and, for example, the National Association of Science Writers, which until just a few weeks ago I was a board member of. But this is a project of NASW and the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing and the Knight Science Journalism Program at MIT and many other organizations that are trying to enable and support that kind of professional and skills development that is so essential to continuing to strengthen the field.
I want to touch on one writing topic, just because of your expertise as a writer, and now, as certainly in the last 10 years, as a reader of science content. I've noticed you mentioned before storytelling when it comes to scientific writing. I've noticed that you've done it a lot in your writing. I noticed that you have a number of articles on your site that are very extensive when it comes to that, and that do it really well. Can you cite a favorite article or two and the story or anecdote that went with it that tells an interesting scientific story?
Sure. Gosh, there are so many. I mean, the reason that we started the site is because of our admiration for so many stories, of course. And there's a lot of emphasis on narrative storytelling at the Open Notebook. And I think sometimes when people think about narrative, they think about these really big, sweeping, 4 to 6 to 10,000 word pieces that are just chock full of narrative. But I think it's really important to recognize that narrative can come in really small doses, and that it's stories that are what change minds and that are what motivate action. And it's not facts. We have to get the facts right. That's kind of that's the first imperative of all journalism, is to get the facts right. But facts alone aren't enough to change minds. And that is the job of stories. And so when we talk about storytelling, we're talking about connecting data to human beings, to people's lived experience. We're talking about identifying the emotions and motivations behind the science. We're talking about action and scenes and telling details that humanize science and that place it appropriately in our minds as a human endeavor that is imperfect but powerful. One example that I often bring up when I just think about narrative storytelling that I like is a really delightful story, and this is quite a number of years old now, but it's a story that the writer Brian Vostog wrote for the Washington Post back in around 2011 or 2012. Brian was a science reporter at the Post, and he stumbled upon a news release about this amateur dinosaur footprint tracker who lived in Maryland outside of DC, and who had found this baby dinosaur footprint, I think. And Brian saw a press release about that and thought, oh, that's cool, and maybe that would be like a daily story for the newspaper. But then as he dug into it more, he found out that this dinosaur tracker, Ray Stanford, was actually this kind of legendary amateur but extremely expert dinosaur footprint tracker. And he ended up writing a story about a profile of Ray Stanford. And I really the story was fascinating. I would encourage any of your listeners to go dig it up. The title of that story is I think it's like The Tireless Tracker Who Rewrote the Book on Dinosaur Footprints in Maryland, or something like that. and it's by Brian Vostog. And we have an interview with Brian about that story at the Open Notebook, and about how he found it and how he pursued it. But it's just really wonderfully engaging from the very beginning. There's this opening scene in the story that Brian is out in the field with Ray Stanford, and they're splashing around in a stream, and he describes him as having the coiled energy of a stalking cat, and he describes what he's wearing. He's wearing these knee-high boots, and they're leaving these shallow heel prints that fill with water, and just this kind of allusion to how the dinosaur footprints were formed in the first place. And he describes him as crouching and scanning, and his hair waving in the sunshine. And it all sounds, as I'm describing it, it sounds kind of over the top, and I think it was sort of intentionally over the top on Brian's part. But it creates this fantastic scene, and you come away from these opening paragraphs of the story with this real tangible sense of this fellow as a person, and what he's like in doing this work. And then Brian goes on to tell this fascinating story that takes this really wild left turn toward the end, and it's just such a great story. I love it, and I reference it really often.
I can grasp it from the way that you're telling it. What represents success for your organization?
Well, our goal is, this might sound trite, but our goal is to be helpful, I guess. Our goal is to make a difference for science journalists around the world, and also for journalists who may not think of themselves as science journalists, but who are sometimes called upon to cover science. And that's really important, because most people don't get their news from science journalists. Most Americans are tuning into their local TV stations or their local newspapers, and are getting the news of the day that affects their lives from political reporters, from education reporters, from general assignment reporters, city hall reporters, etc., who are all incredibly skilled and who are dealing with stories that touch on science in some way, and they have to make decisions about how to cover those stories. And I hope that the Open Notebook can be valuable for them as well. I also, I think if we can help to provide support and empowerment to science journalists around the world who may not have as much access to training in science journalism as is available in the U.S., then I think that will have been a success. I'm not sure that I have an endpoint in mind. I don't see ending anytime soon. It's funny to think back on when we started. Jeannie and I thought that maybe we would do a couple dozen of these interviews and then be done. And I remember explicitly saying, I think people might want to read a couple dozen of these. It's not like they're going to want to read 75 of them. And now that we've done, 150 interviews or something like that, I guess I've proven myself wrong.
One other thing, I typically, these interviews that I've done have typically been super serious, super focused, very straight, very serious. But if you go to your website, there is something there that I would say is, I wrote absurd as the word, but I'm not sure that does it justice, because it really is amazing in its in the way that it is constructed. What in the world is the world's finest science-themed Peeps diorama contest? I felt like I was watching John Oliver as I was scrolling through some of those.
Yes, I think absurd is a perfectly appropriate word. It is, what is the world's finest science-themed Peeps diorama contest? It is the funnest thing ever. The Peeps diorama contest is something that we've done for 2 years now, and we'll do it again. It's been a blast. It is a partnership between the Open Notebook and 3 people who really, it was their brainchild. Kate Ramsayer and Helen Fields and Joanna Church, who are, Kate and Helen are science writers, and the 3 of them had been, over the years, had been involved in constructing dioramas out of peeps, which, if you're not familiar, is a whole thing. So, dioramas like you used to make in grade school, like a three-dimensional thing in a shoebox or whatever, but making dioramas specifically out of peeps, the Easter candy treat, the marshmallow treat, is I guess I would say it is a form of art. At least it's a form of crafting. And the Washington Post used to host a Peeps diorama contest, and Kate and Helen and Joanna used to enter that, and they had some really great dioramas, like a Hamilton, the musical Hamilton, a Hamel Peeps diorama, and they had a Moby Peep diorama, and they had a number of others. And then one year, the Washington Post broke everyone's heart by stopping hosting the Peeps diorama contest. Inexplicably. I don't know why they did that, because it was so beloved. But Helen and Joanna and Kate decided that what they should do is come up with a science-themed Peeps diorama contest. And they're friends of mine, and they approached me about that idea, and it took me about a millisecond to say, yes, the Open Notebook does want to host a science-themed Peeps diorama contest. And of course, it will be the world's finest science-themed Peeps diorama contest. I think it's also the only one. And so we, 2 years ago, started that, and we got around 50 entries, and they are phenomenal. If you go to theopennotebook.com/peeps, you can find they are works of art. And okay, yes, it is absurd to craft dioramas out of peeps. I will admit that, but it is also wonderful. And I will also say that I find them incredibly touching, actually. Some of them, the craftsmanship, first of all, on them is incredible. They're these tiny little things, and you can zoom in on the photos and see the little details, and they're just incredible. And they're done, some of them are by adults, some of them are by children, some are by families, some are by school classrooms. And I just find them so inspiring, and they're a way for people to express their appreciation and curiosity about science in a different form, and a particularly sticky form. And the Peeps contest, I have to say, this year's Peeps contest was a bit interrupted by the start of the pandemic. The original deadline for the contest fell right around the time when everything was hitting the fan in the spring, and we decided to push it back a little bit and give people more time, especially because kids were now going to be home from school and maybe needing things to do and so on. And when those entries started rolling in, they were just like a balm for the soul, because they're so creative and clever and touching. And there's a family that has been winners of the contest for 2 years in a row now. And the first year, the family, led by their 14-year-old daughter, created this Hidden Figures Peeps diorama, Hidden Peeps, and then that was our golden Peep award. And then the next year, they did Chicks Save the Planet, chicks like the little peeps, and their daughter is now 15 years old. And this is like a diorama that highlights this wave of youth activism around the world calling attention to climate change. And it's so great. It's the best thing ever. So I encourage all of your listeners to put their peeping hats on and be thinking about what they could do to create a science-themed Peeps diorama contest for the hashtag Peep Your Science 2021 contest, because it's just around the corner.
And as much as the passion that you showed in talking about it, it becomes 10 times higher. And I think you get it becomes contagious when you look at them, and you're just reveling in the magic in the artistry. All right, two last questions to wrap things up here. I feel like at asking you what advice you have for science journalists, which is the typical kind of question that I would ask at the end of the podcast, that We've essentially done that for almost 40 minutes now. So different question.
Right.
What advice would you have for someone who wants to create a journalism community?
My experience running the Open Notebook over the last decade has been really a moving experience for me because it has shown me that there is such community out there and that there's such a generosity of spirit among science journalists. And, I'm sure that this is true within any journalistic community, that people want to help each other. And of course, there is a sense in which science journalists are competitive with each other to get the story first and so on. But what I've seen in our community that has been so profoundly encouraging to me is that there's just this kind of endless well of generosity among science journalists to share from their experience, to share their failures as well as their successes and their doubts and their imposter syndrome and the blind alleys that they've gone down and the mistakes that they've made, as well as the good ideas and the tricks and tips and tools and, brilliant, world-changing, great ideas. And so I think what running the Open Notebook has shown me is that you don't have to build a community. That community is there, and that in any group of journalists, that there's a fundamental goodness and generosity that all you need to do is to kind of create a mechanism for it to express itself, and then we all reap the benefits. So for someone who's trying to create a journalism community, I think be emboldened to feel that there's going to be a hunger for that community to exist.
Regardless of what kind of community it is, certainly there are many different communities that can be formed. So last question, is there a journalism organization that you would like to salute?
Oh, yes. Well, there are a lot of them, I suppose. Well, first of all, I would be remiss if I did not talk about the National Association of Science Writers. And I'll admit that I have a bias here. Until recently, as I mentioned, I was on the board of NASW, but this organization has been my professional home for more than 20 years and does so much for science writers of all kinds in the U.S. and around the world. And just, it's a volunteer-driven organization. It's an organization that has one full-time employee and hundreds of volunteers that do an incredible amount to support the professional development and the needs of science writers, and to promote science writing as a craft and as an imperative in society. I also want to mention a new initiative that I think is really cool. It's the SPJ, Society of Professional Journalists Race and Gender Hotline. The Race and Gender Hotline is a collaboration, I understand, between SPJ and the new association called the Trans Journalist Association. And it's like a confidential hotline resource for reporters and editors and photographers, art directors to provide guidance from Black and LGBTQ experts about whatever conundrums that journalists might encounter over the course of covering race and gender issues. They can just type their question into the website and then get connected up with an expert who's being paid by SPJ and the Trans Journalists Association to serve as a consultant on those questions. So I just think it's a really great and needed initiative and a really great idea. And then I also just recently learned about this really cool organization that I just thought I'd mention. It's called Resolve Philly. And it's a nonprofit that has a mission, this is in Philadelphia, that has a mission to advance journalism that's built on equity and on elevating and empowering community voices and on shining a light on community efforts to create social change. And I learned about it through a couple of talks that I attended. And I just think Resolve Philly is a really awesome organization. It's a collaboration between a number of different newsrooms in that area, and it seems like a really great model for community-based, collaborative solutions journalism. I think it started through the Solutions Journalism Network, which is another really great organization, and has become its own independent thing.
Siri, thank you for joining us. We wish you the best of success for the next 10, 20, 30 years and beyond with the Open Notebook.
Thank you so much for having me.
I like any organization where the definition of success is, we just want to be helpful. I was so impressed with the community that Siri Carpenter has put together. In fact, after I got done editing the podcast, I immediately wrote an email to a couple of writers in my field, baseball coverage, to see what they thought about certain aspects of the Open Notebook community. Other journalism communities could definitely take a lesson from the science writing world. And also, if you haven't already paused the podcast to look at the diorama contest, please do so. You won't regret it. The Journalism Salute is dedicated to the memory of Dr. Robert Cole, who taught journalism at my alma mater, Trenton State College, the College of New Jersey, for more than 30 years. He inspired hundreds of future journalists. I know that some have nicknamed him Father Journalism, but I think you could also go with the Open Notebook, because he was so helpful to anyone who came to him with questions. And I want to give a shout out to another professor at the college, Kim Pearson, who similarly has inspired hundreds of students who went into public relations, journalism, and community work. Professor Pearson similarly always seems to have endless amounts of time to help with anything her students need. She just got a great shout out in the school alumni magazine. Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. If you're interested in following along with us, follow us on Twitter at Journalism Salute, SALUT. There are more episodes to come. Thank you for tuning in.